Good evening, and welcome to this episode of Seven Steps. I am Seven, and I will be your guide through the weirder side of the internet. Tonight, we have compiled stories from across the globe for your listening pleasure. Without much further ado, let's get into the first story. I work in the South Pole. I'm aware that sounds exciting, and it truly is, but it's a difficult job with taxing hours. We were sent to the middle of Antarctica with thousands of miles of snow and ice on all sides. We worked a solid 7 to 5, and with the lack of recreation, we typically do 18-hour days. However, we do have slow satellite Wi-Fi, which is what keeps me sane during the long days. Regardless, all this wasn't the problem. The problem was the sheer atmosphere of oppression. The whole place didn't feel right. Most of the facility is subterranean, with covered heaters atop the roof and entrance into a cement stairwell. The bunker is what you'd expect. Gray, concrete square with men and women's bunking areas, and a few couples' rooms. Large bathroom facility with a shower and toilet stalls, plus 3 labs and a fully stocked cafeteria, all with no windows. There was also a medical bay, and 2 rooms with couches for therapy. After the double section entrance was the rec room, and it had a pool table and a bar, and the walls were naughty pine wood paneling like from the 1970s. The rooms were all attached by a long, dingy hallway, including 2 offices with desks and chairs, where I spent most of my time. Atop the station was an observation deck, reachable with a ladder, with windows where we could see and hear the outdoors, but we usually only went up there to smoke, since it was nearly as cold as the outside. The whole place was poorly lit, fluorescent lights and a few lamps in corners, but overall it looked like a dingy green underground cement hell. Outside is exactly what you would expect from Antarctica. Snow for hundreds of miles in all directions. If you have a fear of open water, it feels like that, except you have to walk in it. I was a little surprised as to why they invited so many of us on this particular expedition. There were 12 of us total. Usually 6 would suffice. All professionals in our field. However, the range of work each of us did was surprising. Typically, it would be a singular field of study to accomplish a common goal, but on this expedition there were several different professions. The first was an older Finnish gentleman, a medical doctorate, who had experience tending to injuries in frozen climates. The next, a physicist who was really as surprised as us to be in the South Pole, for their work is often theoretical, when in practice requires a team in and of itself. There was a British husband and wife team, both of whom were geologists, and there were 3 men in their 30s for maintenance and driving, specializing in sub-zero conditions and masters in any repair field, I'm sure. There was also a biologist, a young lady who kept her hair in a bun and wore her lab coat inside at all times. She was all work and no play. Then there were even 2 therapists. Yes, 2. The first is what you'd expect, a middle-aged lady with blonde bangs and a clipboard, always wearing a warm smile. The other? Well, he was a tall, lanky fellow. He was gaunt and his hair was jet black. Honestly, I had no idea why he would be a therapist. I myself was intimidated to even say hi to him. Never saw anyone join him in therapy unless he specifically asked them, and I usually tried to avoid him. There was another man who I assumed was a cook, until I saw we had to make our own meals. He was an odd, mousy-looking fellow. He didn't speak to anyone, and when I tried, he would simply ignore me. I maintained that he would be my favorite person in this expedition, since he kept 100% to himself. And then there's me. I was the chaplain. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. There are half a dozen professionals here, and they need a chaplain? Well, I didn't think it made sense, but when I was contacted by the organization funding the trip, I didn't argue. They were offering a lot of money, and in my line of work, that's a rarity. The expedition was to be 6 months, and we were to each conduct specific experiments. I don't know what the others were assigned, but I was to journal on the religious implications of the expedition, and to provide any counsel for all the other participants of this trip, for any sect or faith. The counsel assignment I didn't have a problem with, but the journaling? That's the kind of thing college freshmen journal on in Theology 101. Either way, I was getting paid, so I sucked it up and spent the rest of my free time downloading movies and games to pass the long hours in between counseling. Surprisingly, a lot of people came to me for religious discussion. I won over the maintenance guys' approval when I cracked open a beer with them and talked Catholicism on the old red rec room couch. I'm a Protestant minister, so they were a little standoffish at first. We became fast friends, and even though I couldn't bless them or give confession, I think it helped ease stress to feel like they could disclose matters of faith as well as just have a fun conversation. Either way, I got along well with everyone after enough time. The physicist was a staunch atheist, so we played pranks on each other frequently. I would hide his laptop out of easy reach, blaring Jesus Take the Wheel, and he would wake me up half the days with No Church in the Wild. I considered him my second best friend in the compound, even though that song did give me the chills when I thought about how far away we were from civilization. My best friend was the odd man. He was always around the rec room when I was, and he never spoke. He wore an orange hoodie and jeans indoors, and always seemed like he was drinking alone at the dimly lit makeshift bar. I thought nothing of it, since our schedules were all different, and I could absolutely condone drinking yourself senseless in a place like this. It was lonely most days. We did our own things at our own station, often eating lunch there, frozen meals or MREs usually. I did spend quite some time talking with the doctor. He was a Buddhist, so we spent many mornings meditating in his medical station under the buzzing fluorescent lights. He said that the place gave him an odd feeling. It was hard to be centered here in this cement brick buried in the snow. It did get to me after a while. When I was alone and the lights were quiet, I could hear whispering. After one particular incident where I swore that I could hear words, I started wearing headphones, and they helped quite a bit with filling my ears with noise and blocking out the outside world. Once a week, supplies were dropped in from the coastal base hundreds of miles away. We restocked the cigarettes, the whiskey, and other non-essentials like food and water. I say that to point out that whoever was paying for this was dropping serious money. I never met the main client. Rather, I was contacted through their representatives. Apparently, the man funding it was very wealthy and very driven and very religious, and he was highly invested in this expedition. He wanted a success, but no one knew his goal with this ordeal he was funding. Also, once a week, we would go out in the Snow Rover, a giant SUV that could ride over the snow and ice. We would take samples of ice and examine a previous dig site from the last crew. I could not imagine the crew that had to come all the way out here to build the facility, but I bet they got paid crazy money. Some days we would all just go to get out and see the sun, because we could not leave during a blizzard. But most days only the necessary crew for the excavation would go, and whenever we went we had to wear a harness attached to a rope to the SUV to avoid slipping down the ice and being injured. And we can only go once a week due to the outside conditions and the distance to the dig site. I mention both of these to reiterate the fact that we are alone out here, and if a plane came Monday, we had 7 days until it would return. Then was the first big shift. It was exactly 2 months in the base. The team who left that day were the geologists, the biologist, and one maintenance man to drive and man the harnesses. They left in good spirits and remained at the site for hours. However, they returned shaken. They burst in the door while I was in the rec room with the therapist, and we immediately noticed the fear in their eyes. The lady geologist ran to the couple's room without saying a word. Her husband chased after, calling her name. We asked what happened and noticed the biologist was crying. The other therapist entered the room like a ghost, and without word he ushered her into his office and closed the door. The doctor burst in and boomed, "What on earth is going on?" "I don't know," said the first therapist. She was anxious, and so was I. "Where's Jack?" I said, the maintenance worker who drove the SUV. "Wait, where's the car?" I inquired, opening the door to the outside. I saw nothing but our flag, a long set of footprints and miles of ice gleaming in the sunlight. We sat for what felt like hours in the rec room, all of us who didn't go on the field exposition, that is. The others were in the tall therapist's office. Panicked voices could be heard behind the door, and finally they all exited. The geologist went to their room without saying a word. The biologist sat in one of the empty folding chairs. The therapist stood behind her, hands on the back of the seat. She had clearly been crying since she returned. "We got there ahead of schedule," she started, gathering her composure. "The dig site. We arrived at 0700 instead of 8, so we got to work early. At first all was fine. Jack was in the SUV minding all the harnesses. I was chiseling away at a small patch of ice when I heard the others call from below. We looked at her, hanging on her every shaking word. She continued. I slid down to the base of the hole, about 30 meters down, I think. They had struck a hard surface. We all dug together and pulled out a massive lockbox. Immediately we assumed it was left from the last dig, but the design was old. It looked like something from World War II. It was heavy and sealed shut. We tugged on the rope to signal Jack, but there was no response. We started calling out for him, but he never called back. We couldn't see him from our vantage point. After a solid 10 minutes of screaming, we made our way up the hill, using our tools. We used an extra length of cord to pull the box up. It took all 3 of us, but eventually we got it. When we reached the top, Jack was nowhere to be found. We searched the perimeter for well over an hour, but with maximum visibility, we would have seen him. We checked for holes in the ice and signs of footprints, but his earlier tracks never left the side of the SUV. We loaded the box in the back and kept searching. And then we noticed something we absolutely should have already seen. When we climbed atop the vehicle for a better vantage, we saw a massive, single message in the snow. Run. We looked at her in disbelief, the mutual feeling of sympathy and that I could have searched better people tend to have. She started tearing up again. We panicked. We drove away, but none of us can operate a vehicle designed for snow and ice. We crashed into a massive pothole about a mile south of here, and we left the car and walked back. The find is still there, and Jack is somewhere in that deserted wasteland. After this, she broke down into sobs and left the dorm. Jack hadn't answered a single radio call or even made an attempt at reaching us. The dig site was an hour's drive from our base, and we were thousands of miles from any other researchers. We were essentially powerless to do anything. First things first, said one of the other repairmen. We need to get our ride back. He suited up, and then he and the other maintenance worker left on a snowmobile designed for short distance. Now, I don't know how they did it, but they managed to bring the SUV back safely in less than an hour. By now it was getting dark, and the search for Jack would be too dangerous to continue tonight. We didn't sleep that night. The odd man didn't even come to bed. He just wandered the halls drinking. I lay there, listening to music to drown out the sounds of the silent sobs coming from down the hall. This concrete slab, this tomb in the middle of a frozen dead zone. We were completely and utterly alone. The doctor remarked before bed, if Jack is still alive, he may be better off out there. The next morning we set out, all of us, except the 2 therapists and the odd man, who I assumed was sleeping off a hangover. We dragged the lockbox out of the vehicle and laid it in the rec room. We loaded up and decided to deal with opening it later. We searched the dig site and surrounding area until evening and turned up nothing. The message in the snow was nowhere to be found, and there had been no snowfall that night. We found no tracks, no signs, no body, no anything. We returned, depressed and feeling responsible for our missing companion. When we returned, however, we were greeted by an odd sight. A jet. On the snow was a ski-fitted jet, and not like the crappy junk plane that dropped us off, this was an expensive private jet. We entered the facility, and to the sound of loud, booming laughter, a short, bald man with a white goatee sat in the rec room with the shrinks. He was smoking a cigar and wore a very nice suit. 2 very large men in sunglasses stood on either side of the door, and we were slightly stunned. "Well," the man said in a hard southern drawl, turning to us, "if it ain't the rest of the party." "Who—" I was cut short. "Allow me to introduce myself." He stood extending his ringed hand. "Earl Redacted. Pleased to meet you all, finally." We took turns awkwardly introducing ourselves, realizing this must be the guy in charge. He invited us into the cafeteria to have an official meeting. This was the second weird shift in the trip. He offered condolences in regards to Jack and expressed that it was no one's fault he went missing. "As for that message in the snow," he said, lowering his voice, "I would say this whole place tells you to run at some point. Don't let it get to you." He finally revealed his focus of the expedition, that we were there to discover any signs of past visits man had ventured. He also expressed that he wanted to colonize the South Pole, but needed to know the psychological effects of people living here. That's why he had sent 2 mental health associates and a minister, he said, pointing at me as he said this, making me feel exposed and awkward. He again thanked us and sent us to bed after the best steak dinner I had ever had prepared. This guy was serious. He flew in his personal chef just to thank us for our work. The next morning, after bacon and eggs breakfast, he took us into the tall therapist's office one at a time to shoot the shit, as he so delicately put it. When it was my turn, He was very respectful, a gesture I appreciate when no one knows I'm a minister, but feels forced at times when there is pretense. "How are you, Reverend?" he asked softly. "Well," I replied, not sure how to answer that question in light of the past few days. "Glad to hear it," he smiled at the ground. "Son, I'm going to level with you here. You are the most important person here." "How's that?" I inquire, wondering if he's flattering me or not. Well, he started looking for the right words. "This trip is more for psychological research than anything." I started to ask, but he cut me off. "We want a religious figure and at least 2 therapists to log mental strain on living out here. We want to build a new civilization, but we have been testing different groups in small segments of time." "But why me?" It was the foremost of many pressing questions. "Well," he said, smiling, "I'm a Methodist boy myself, but I picked you because of an article you wrote a while back. You said in the final line that you have the same philosophy as me." "What's that?" I inquired, as I had written a few articles in my time and wasn't sure which one he meant. "To truly understand God, we must also understand his counterpart." I immediately knew the article to which he referred. It was an article I wrote after seminary on demonology in modern society. I shuddered, as this was an unpleasant field of research. Either way, the man had done his work on me, but I still wasn't sure what a short article on demons qualified me for on a mission in the Antarctic. I left the room with Earl, and we proceeded to rejoin the others. We predominantly listened to him rant on, rather than talk amongst ourselves. We just didn't feel right. We were here, in the warmth, while this man was bellowing on, and our friend was out there cold and alone. I overheard many times the biologist and geologist ask to leave. At first the requests were simply brushed off, but by the last request he sternly reminded him that they were under contract. They resigned themselves to their room after that. Earl left that night with the instruction to report our findings, if there were any. He then boarded his plane with his bodyguards and left promptly. Before bed I swear I heard whispering from the observation deck, but when I went to see, there was nothing there. The next day, a massive blizzard rolled in. We resolved that Jack had died in the snow outside. No person could have survived a sub-zero blizzard after 3 days. This is officially where things went bad. We decided to open the lockbox. It was sealed by metal welding all the way around. It took a little while, but the other 2 maintenance men used blowtorches on the chest until it finally came free. They strained to pull the lid off of its container. We gathered round, and I found myself closest to the box. They flipped the heavy lid over, which shook black soot loose from the chest. We coughed, and when it cleared, we saw the contents. There was nothing, or at least nothing important. We found a piece of string, a thimble, and salt scattered about. We sat there, rubbing our heads and looking at each other. We discussed why this would be out there in the ice, so many layers deep. We talked a little while until I noticed the physicist leaving. He was as pale as a ghost, so I chased him to ask what was the matter. "Hey!" I shouted as I caught up to him in the door. "You good?" He just stood there, shaking his head, and after a long pause he just responded, "No." "What is it?" I was curious as to why he was acting so strange out of nowhere. Meanwhile, I saw the other participants walk down the hall to the cafeteria. Only I noticed the man in the orange hoodie was nowhere to be seen. My thoughts were shaken when the physicist spoke up. "Did you see the word on the lid?" he asked quietly. "No," I was confused. "I must have missed it." "Can you read Hebrew?" he asked, choking back tears. "No," I replied. "I studied Greek." "Wait, can you?" "Yeah, I'm Jewish, or at least I was. I can read Hebrew well enough, at least, though at this point I wish I couldn't." "What did it say?" "Dybbuk," he said, as a tear rolled down his face. I'd never seen him like this before, and frankly, I was a little scared. "Can't buy into that." "No," he shouted, cutting me off. "You know as well as I do that this place is wrong. It does things to you. God, the first week I chased footsteps around the shower every morning until I realized I was alone every single time. Listen," I placed my hand on his shoulder. "We're gonna be okay. I wish I could say I was telling the truth, but that box did have some sort of weird feeling about it. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were so loud I heard them over my headphones. I went to check around, and no one was awake besides me. I heard soft sobbing from the couple's room, but I knew better than to disturb them. They had it pretty rough right now. As I returned to my bunk, I walked by the cafeteria and caught something awful. I turned to see the most horrendous sight I have ever seen. All the chairs and tables were scattered and flipped. Food was smeared all along the walls, and ceilings and utensils and appliances were scattered all about. In the center of the floor was a massive, rusted steel cross, and nailed to it was Jack. He was soaked from head to toe in blood, and his eyes looked as if every vein had burst. Barbed wire covered his arms and legs, and nails were driven through his wrists and ankles. He was bald and thin, and when we made eye contact, he shook violently and then shrieked through spattering blood. Belphegor. Now was my turn to lose control. I fell backwards and slid on the tile. I must have been screaming my lungs out, for everyone poured into the hallway, asking in confusion what was happening. I had urinated, and I pointed to the cafeteria through tears and panicked breaths. The inside was totally normal. Nothing was out of place. No cross, no Jack, and no destruction. Last thing I remember was showering and opening a bottle of Jack. It was only 3 hours later that I awoke in the rec room covered by a blanket. Jane, the therapist, was asleep on the opposite couch. She was sweet through all this, and I'm sure she was disappointed in my lack of professionalism. I was still drunk when I stood, and everyone was still asleep, and the blizzard still blasted our compound. I wandered the hall and heard the sobbing from the couple's room again. I realized in my stupor that they may need help. I knocked softly on the door, but the crying continued uninterrupted. And before I could knock again, I had to resolve myself to the toilet. I ran and vomited into the bowl, now feeling slightly more alert. As I stood, wiping my mouth, I caught a brief glimpse of a figure leaving the bathroom. It was tall and dark, but I couldn't catch any more details. I had finally had enough and returned to my bunk. I fell into a restless sleep that night, but I slept nonetheless. I awoke the next day to someone shaking my arm. Wake up, my vision focused to see one of the maintenance men. Power's out and people are missing. I stood groggily. He turned to the hallway where I could hear voices in the cafeteria. I saw the only other person in the room was the physicist, and he was facing away from me towards the wall. "Come on," I slurred, and he didn't stir. He just laid there, and I only left because I saw him breathing. I walked into the cafeteria. It was lit by emergency candles on the table, where I saw the biologist, Jane, the doctor, and the 2 maintenance men. Counting me, this was less than half of our original group. They turned, and the other maintenance man said, "Well, look who it is. You gonna scare the hell out of us again?" I didn't smile or disagree. I just sat beside the doctor and asked where the geologists were. "They won't answer their door," Jane said, her age truly beginning to show in her tired, drawn eyes. "The other therapist is missing as well." "We're going to leave," chimed the biologist. "As soon as the blizzard dies down, fuck their contracts." "How? We're 1,000 miles from the nearest base," I felt negative for saying, but I didn't want to risk certain death for a little cabin fever. "Well," said the man who woke me, "we have a massive sled. We'll load with every tank of gas, and then we'll just have to get within 50 miles of the nearest base to be within radio contact. We have GPS, we'll drive in shifts, and we'll take our time to avoid pitfalls." "Is this agreeable?" asked the doctor. Everyone nodded in agreement. "In that case," he continued, "I suggest we spend the next few days together, hoping the missing members return, and if not, then we will beg their forgiveness in hell." I spent the day sitting in a daze. I just had no clue why we were all so distraught. We all layered up in the dark and hunkered down. We made small talk in an attempt to fill the void. The dancing candlelight played tricks on our eyes, and the dark was oppressive. The 6 of us sat there, just sitting, and just waiting. Finally, around 1800, Jane suggested we check on the geologists. We stayed close down the hallway and heard the sobbing, and it was softer but still present. Jane knocked, waited, and knocked again. She shouted she was coming in, but the door was locked. The maintenance man began pounding his fist and threatening to break in. He took a key ring and picked out a key. It fit the door and slowly opened it to the bedroom. Inside was a nightmare. The first thing I noticed was the blood, as it was everywhere. The walls, the bed, the ceiling, the floors. It covered the lamp and bathed the room in a deep red. On the bed was the male geologist. His eyes were wide open in shock and his mouth hung agape. His throat was torn out and his leg was chewed to the bone. His wife sat beside him with her back to us. She turned, covered in blood herself. She was crying and chewing. She buttered the bloody meat while sobbing. Her expression turned from sorrow to one of pure, unadulterated rage. She contorted her mouth to scream, but only a hoarse gargle and bits of flesh came out. The maintenance worker closed the door, and we all panicked in unison. "Get the door," the doctor shouted. We followed him to the kitchen and pulled tables in front of the door. We piled enough furniture to board that animal in her cage. I must have fallen asleep at some point because a massive blast awoke me. I looked up to see others jumping to their feet. We got ourselves to the ladder and climbed to the observation deck. Outside we saw blackness expanding, all except for a large patch of light a few meters away. Through the whiteout conditions we could make out fire. The SUV was in flames. Gas tanks stacked around it. Atop the flames was a person. Upon closer inspection, I could see it was naked and dancing. "Oh, God!" The biologist lifted her hand to her mouth. "Jane?" It was Jane. She was naked and being burned by the flames. Her howls echoed through the dark storm, and we watched as the fire consumed her body. She shrieked and screeched until finally remaining silent forever. We walked downstairs, feeling hopeless. We sat in the dark of the rec room, and no one spoke until morning. The physicist was still in bed. He was trying to ignore everything, but at this point I knew he was too far gone. Footsteps were loud in the unoccupied rooms, but at this point I'd given up. If I was to die here, then so be it. We huddled in blankets and coats against the wall. We sat and we cried, and a candle in front of our feet was the only light source. I closed my eyes so tight so not to see the dark shadow pacing the room in front of us. Next morning the power returned. The lights were flickering, and we stood slowly in the dim, intermittent glow. I heard music playing in the showers. We all walked together and looked inside. Within was the song "Jesus Take the Wheel" being played on loop from an MP3 player. We walked into the dull gray room and saw the physicist naked, sitting on the floor in front of the iPod player. Blood appeared to be running into the drain beneath him. He slowly turned his head to me. He held up his left hand to his lips, and he hissed a long "shh." With the other hand, he lifted his bloodied, mutilated genitals. He closed his eyes and smiled a large, toothy smile. He whispered behind closed teeth, "I like this song now." "God," said the doctor. He slowly approached the bloodied man, attempting to keep him calm. He continued, "It's okay, boy. I'm here to help." The physicist snickered again, eyes still closed and teeth still bared in a snarling grin. As the doctor got close, the man shrieked with inhuman volume and sprang forward. He tackled the doctor to the ground and sunk teeth deep into the old man's jugular. Blood ran down both the doctor's neck and the physicist's teeth. He stood, turning his violent intent at us. The doctor sputtered blood and choked for air. As the brooding man crouched to leap, a loud bang filled our ears. I fell to the ground in agony. The screeching in my eardrums was unbearable. Finally it cleared, and I saw the physicist now laying dead in a pool of his own blood. In his head was a circular wound that bore all the way through his skull. One of the maintenance workers was holding a smoking pistol. We were now 4. Me, the biologist, and the other 2 maintenance workers. The rest were all now missing or dead. Although the power was on, the satellite was still down, thus ruining our chances for radio and Wi-Fi. We all paced and cried and panicked for hours until finally one of the maintenance men spoke up. "Our only chance at survival is fixing that dish." We looked at him and silently knew he spoke the truth. Outside was still completely whited out from the amount of snow and wind. "I'll go," spoke up the other man. "We'll go together," said the first. The biologist and I knew we could not argue. We watched them in their coats leave into the unforgiving blizzard. We waited for what seemed like hours, searching for radio signals and Wi-Fi. Finally, it all came back. We smiled for the first time in a while and prepared for the men's return. And we sat and we waited, and waited, and waited. We didn't say anything, but we knew. We knew we were the last. She fell asleep in my lap after we cried ourselves tired. Before I closed my eyes, I swear I heard the giggles of a child. I awoke some time later. I was utterly alone, and I yelled for the biologist. I searched each and every room until I found the last thing that I wanted to find. I found her in the observatory. She wrote a lovely note about wanting to see the outside world before she died. In her arm was an empty syringe that I guess is what she used to end her life. Her eyes were blank and staring into oblivion, and I left her to her peace. And now the reason I write this, in probably my last moments of clarity, the reason we were brought here to this frozen hellscape only to die, and the reason I'm sending out this story before I put an emergency flare gun in my mouth. I returned to the office that I had been using, and I was hysterical. I saw my reflection in the display mirror and noticed my eyes were totally black. This sight brought me to smash the mirror, and I sliced my knuckles, which rocked me back to reality. And in my second of clarity, I noticed the slip of paper that fell from the shattered pieces. It was a note with a picture attached. The note read, "If you're reading this, then I hope it's not too late. This place is not what you think. The man in charge is not some religious kook. He is much more dangerous. By now you have found that undiscovered lockbox. In it you probably found some trinkets to spook you. There's probably a minister with you to comment on the materials as evil. And this is their set and setting. That black dust that flew out, it wasn't dust, and it's not evil. God, these people don't want to colonize. You ever wonder why you're so far from any other bases? This is a weapons testing facility. You have unknowingly been testing compounds for a private company, and this particular compound is an untraceable psychosis-inducing strain of a pathogen that is meant for world leaders. The concept is to have the enemy kill themselves. If you've breathed the black dust, then it's too late for you. All you can do is attempt to get this message out. But do not trust the maintenance men, and do not trust the tall therapist. They are working for Earl. They will disappear without a trace shortly after his visit. They've logged your behaviors, so even if the blizzard, which I assume is what you're in already, subsides, you'll be found and killed if you escape. I am so sorry. I lost my entire team, and I wish you never would have come. I am sorry. Dave. The picture attached was what I assume was the previous team. In red ink, a man was circled and labeled me. In the picture was a mousy man in an orange hoodie and jeans. Nothing should be taken at face value. A little bit of skepticism will allow you to navigate these treacherous waters that we call a world. The human element is generally far more terrifying than the supernatural, but that just may not be the case for our next story. I decided to become an archaeologist for two main reasons. One, I hated society. I hated those stupid lowlives not doing anything with their life. And that's why I became hell-bent on accomplishing some groundbreaking discovery. And two, I decided to isolate myself in nether regions of the world, to distance myself from the mindless internet and other modern media which brainwash the masses and make them waste their lives. Under the sponsorship of H.L. Marlowe, I was excavating a certain area in Egypt in search of treasure. The first year was a fruitless search, with only a few pieces of worthless platter and clothing being found. These were carbon dated back to maybe 50 years ago. On the second year, however, a pickaxe struck a limestone structure. This might have been an already raided cache, natural formations, or pretty much anything else, but we were desperate. All men were ordered to abandon post and dig in this one area. As we worked at the limestone, another, stranger rock blocked our progress. It was much harder and utterly foreign to the whole country of Egypt, and indeed foreign to any rock type we knew. It vaguely resembled granite, but was certainly an igneous rock, as evidenced by the large crystals embedded in the volcanic material. We shoveled and picked the stone for hours, and dug 53 feet down, until a pickaxe broke into an opening. We widened the aperture and shone our flashlights in. A large, dark room spread out beneath us, and in the middle of it sat an iron rectangular box. It was rusty and mossy, and I ordered rope and electric torches immediately. Me, Henry, and Amon, Henry being my sponsor and Amon my friend, rappelled in and explored the room with our flashlights. The walls were made out of queer rock, damp and collapsed in places where moss sprouted from the ruins. Though it isn't exactly fair to call the thing moss, since it resembled some type of fungus, clearly not of this earth. It was sickly green hue and seemed to move faintly despite the utter lack of wind. This exhibition of perpetual motion unnerved us, to say the least. Ammon and Henry set down their torches at angles which lit up the whole box. Something about that silent metal rectangle crouching in the middle of an ancient dark room fathoms beneath civilized soil was horrifying. I swallowed and nodded to the others. Crowbars were unstrapped, and we carefully lifted the lid off the box. As we steadily lifted the plank of iron from the box, there was a swishing noise, and we choked on a horrible miasma which escaped into the air. It was this smell of fermentation and decay. It spoke of forbidden aeons far beyond human understanding. Dropping the lid, I covered my mouth, but vomit was already rushing up my throat and out onto the ground. The workers above, seeing our dismay and smelling a subdued semblance of the smell, dropped more rope down. The miasma was so horrible it could make the plants in God's very own garden drop dead with decay. We climbed out fast into the sunlight and fresh air, and I was glad to be rid of any traces of that god-awful place. I vomited again, and so did the others, and Henry threw up thrice more. I felt sick and weak, and could tell the smell was coming on me stronger again. I heard grunts from the workers who retreated from the gaping hole. The smell was escaping. I could just hope it would not hold sway over the world. I had hoped that there was a limit to the miasma, and that the box wasn't a portal to another realm which trapped only an infinite amount of that smell. We all retreated to the campsite as the shadows stretched out and then swallowed the whole world. I eventually drifted off to sleep and awoke when the sun was at its apex. For a change, the sounds of the workers' mining was gone. I had come from New York and hated it because of the crowds of idiots bustling about the ceaseless noise of traffic, so I was glad to have the silence for once. As I set out towards the hole, there was a group already gathered. I had told Ammon and Henry to get the ropes and that we'll be going in again. After our descent, we stalked towards the box and shone our torches into it. The blackness swallowed our light. I picked up a stone and dropped it, counting seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, nothing. 5, 6, splash. I ordered more rope to be hauled down and more electric torches to be passed, along with scented clothes and picks. We descended further into our mysterious discovery, our light beams dancing on the unknown stone walls. As we further submerged ourselves into the darkness, the air got thicker and the smell worse. Some considered turning back in fear that the intensity of the stench may reach unprecedented levels. At about 10 minutes down, the smell made us gag, and we were forced to hold the cloths against our faces. The darkness thickened, and we could barely make out the shape of our flashlights, let alone the beams of light. Dangling from the ropes, we were like puppets on lonely strings. After about 20 minutes of splashing and about 2 inches of slimy, watery fluid, someone was bold enough to remove the cloth from his mouth and shout up into the blackness. His echo bounced off the walls and was suddenly cut off. We had no choice but to trudge on through the unknown. But Henry wasn't too compliant. He complained and begged me to turn back, but in obscene terms I told him that's not an option. We resorted to using our picks like a blind man might use a cane, holding on to each other and swinging our picks frantically before us, listening for a thuck and a feeling of some sort of resistance. We ascertained that we were in a room with a high ceiling and compact walls. After we progressed north along the walls, we assumed that we had entered a tunnel based on the thucking of our picks, and we were right, for on the other end of the tunnel was a light, glimmering vaguely, and we relaxed our grip on the scented cloths. We came to a T-intersection where we could go either left or right, and we voted and continued down the right tunnel. As we continued further into the darkness, it became evident that we were heading towards the source of the foul vapor. Ammon was at the back, Henry in the middle, and I had led the group. So it was me who plummeted down the hole in the ground first. Henry tripped but managed to hold on to some loose brick, and Ammon became stranded in impenetrable darkness. Water or some other fouler fluid cushioned my fall. I flailed like a fish on land in that little pond until I gained my bearings. Now, unsettled, soaked, cold, and alone, I began wishing I was back in New York, where at least I could be safe with society. I saw a faint glimmering of orange light in the distance, and hope spread through me, warming me. I rushed over towards it, tripping over algae and seaweed or other invisible, unspeakable things, and I felt solid ground 5 inches above me and climbed out onto it to find I was directly facing the light. Now I was certain that the source of the smell lay directly ahead of me, and I shuddered. When I touched the wall, I felt a weird, mossy, fleshy thing which faintly vibrated under my arm and which I had no doubt was probably the fungus that we saw earlier. When I reached the end, I saw before me a horrifying expanse of terrifying alien terrain, which was not in any realm of the imagination of this world. It's no use describing how it looked. It's much too terrible for that. All I can give are vague outlines of what I saw and tell you the geometry of the place was contorted beyond all belief. A path made out of that same queer stone from before ran along a lake of black, slimy water until it reached a huge aquatic monolith. The human spider-fish character standing upon that pedestal was something out of this world. A grotesque fishy face with horns and bulging eyes was surmounted upon an arachnoidal body with 6 tentacles in place of spider legs. The front 2 legs were shredded masses of muscles masquerading as human legs. The place was completely alien and ghastly in its weird contours and unheard-of angles, twisting and sloping landscapes totally unaffected by gravity. And that ghastly stench was at its zenith here. It was like a sepulchral breath, like a mass of ghouls breathing out into the air the odor of the grave. Muffled and subdued, a splash sounded behind me. Apparently Henry had fallen. I looked towards the ancient idol looming over the sacrificial table, clutching a trident. I felt myself walk down the stairs and tread down the path. If there was a ceiling somewhere in this place, then it was too high to be visible. Just then I noticed the orange light had no apparent source, like it was magical. I walked up the golden limestone steps towards the statue, and suddenly a surge of paranoia set in. I jerked my head to the left, to the right, behind me, above me, and back to the statue again. I felt shadows darting around the room. I felt eyes peering at me from my blind side. I closed my eyes and recited some prayers, my mouth warped into a whirlwind of frantic whispers. I was so focused on the prayer that I was shocked by a heavy grip on my shoulder. I whirled around, fist raised, and saw Henry gasping, frightened behind me. "Howard," he said, "where are we?" I said I didn't know, and he insisted that we must get out. A gurgling, bubbling noise sounded from behind me, and a green metallic spider leg shot out of the black water and struck the limestone pathway. The 2 legs pulled a writhing fusion of mechanical and biological parts. A huge, ill-defined, pulsating poison-green tumor with ugly veins pulsing along its misshapen structure, connected to the mechanical spider legs, jagged and impossibly contorted and horribly grotesque. The mysterious fungus hung off of the monster, but that's not exactly true. More like the fungus was like an organic part of the creature. The creature sprang at Henry, piercing his skin with a syringe affixed to its spidery limbs, and injected him with something unimaginable. Adrenaline rushed through my veins, and I raised my pickaxe and swung it at the monster, striking its core. A splash of yellow juice squirted from the sides of the pick. Henry shrieked and writhed under the creature's weight, and I pulled the pick out, releasing a further splash of yellow bile, and swung harder this time. A swishing liquid sound rang out as my pick struck another side of the monster's body. Its legs wavered, but it persisted in attacking Henry, and I persisted in attacking it. Jets and streams of the yellow bile were exploding from the thing's wounds and showering us, and finally, with a finishing blow, the thing wavered, faltered, and fell sideways. I never truly believed what I saw, yet despite the sheer horror of that monster, I could swear I saw the form of a far bigger and far more ghoulish thing below the surface of that black water, until it disappeared into the unknown fathoms below. I stooped down to check on Henry. I saw the veins in his body push out against his skin, and his flesh lost its peachy color and turned into a skeletal pale tint. It looked like the blood from his body was being diverted from the arteries and capillaries into his veins, and then into a cataclysmic explosion, his veins burst in an eruption of blood and gore. I can't even start to fathom what that fiend must have injected into poor Henry. I was too shocked and weakened to remember what happened next. All I have are photo snaps of my escape, pictures of a rusty ladder, a pipe I pried open, confined space we crawled through, a smell of shit, which might have been the scent of roses after that ghastly miasma, an upward curve in the claustrophobic darkness, and then I remembered breaking through something and a flood of light as sand spilled down. And so I came out through the sewage system of some big city, into the scorching sunlight and huge skyscrapers towering above me. Overwhelmed with joy and exhaustion, I fainted. I awoke in a hospital and was questioned by authorities. After answering questions accordingly, I was assured the search would be conducted. They found that the tunnels I was talking about were flooded. Apparently the pipe I had disturbed experienced a sudden eruption of sewage from and to some unknown source and flooded the underground facility. After I recovered, I returned to my room for a final night. I was weary after hours of questioning by my employer and by the authorities, and I wished nothing but to take a hot shower. When I turned on the shower, it shuddered for a moment, belched, and a black, thick liquid spurted out of it. As the black slime came out of the showerhead, a foul but familiar stench assaulted my nostrils. I turned the tap off so hard that I dislodged the handle. Then I stormed out of the hotel, forgetting even to turn in my key. The last anyone there saw of me was when I got to the airport. I retreated to New York, to my home. I used to despise this peasant-filled shithole, but now I cherished it. The bustle of civilization gave me comfort. It reminded me that I'm not in those lonely, silent, dark tunnels. I still couldn't force myself to go outside the house, too afraid of leaving the familiar and safe. And I could not bear to come into contact with water, as I was too mortified. I did not turn on the sinks or the shower, and I only drank juice, which, like everything else, I ordered online. I hated the fucking internet, but now I was forced to use it. And then, my lack of hygiene had given birth to an ear infection. Pain exploded inside my ear canal, and it felt like my eardrum was hammering out the beat to the newest Metallica album. I would have had to call a doctor, but I was too scared. And during those 2 solitary years, my money ran out, and they cut off my power, phone, and water. I would have been glad for the latter 2, if I was not plunged into complete darkness. Eventually, the ear infection took away my hearing, and now I was cut off from my last semblance of reality. Darkness, silence, and solitude, and the tunnels. I kept seeing Henry die to that hellspawn. I kept seeing that shape in the water, so horrible. I cannot bear this eternal perdition, being trapped in my own house, which tortures me with its dark silence. I have thought this out, or at least thought it out as much as my frenzied mind has permitted me, and I've come to the decision that I will take my own life. This is my memoir. Fuck this world. The world we live in can seem so surreal, but the reality is that danger may be lurking around every corner. Walk cautiously into life, and always remember, at any given point, you're only 7 steps away from being one of my stories.